I want to just put forward this question before we engage God's Word, and it's related to it. The question is, what kind of greatness do you believe in? What is the greatness that you truly believe in, that you give yourself to? Like, I want to be great in this way. Because we all, at some level, want some sense of greatness. We want to believe that somehow we have value. That's why we pay all of our celebrities and rock stars and what have you so much money, because we want to live bigger than life. There's something about us that's always wanting to connect with a sense of something big. And the question is, where does it come from and how are we driven? And I know that's a very big question, and I know the way that we answer that might seem sometimes initially very simple. Oh, we can give this kind of right answer. And a part of us, perhaps, if you're like me, begins to go down the line of what's the right answer to that question. And so we think, oh, well, I believe in God, so therefore it's a God-centered question. But I think if we're more honest, we realize that a part of us might try to give the right answer, but if we are also trying to give the real answer, meaning another part of ourselves, we'd have to admit that sometimes the greatness we pursue is a much more self-centered, self-consuming kind of greatness. We just want attention. We want affirmation of ourselves. We even want to think of drawing everything around us. And so that struggle for greatness can be a challenging one. And as we continue in our long focus and series, Encountering Jesus through the Gospel of Luke, we come now to the 22nd chapter, and we encounter Jesus once again bringing us to face this question, to grasp the reality of two powers that are vying for us. Two ways that we might think about who we are and what greatness is. And I think it's very timely that we are launching into the Lenten season tomorrow. We choose the 40 days that come from starting tomorrow to Good Friday. And so we begin to enter in that. And Lenten season is preparing ourselves to really take in the whole of what Jesus did in his own death and resurrection. But it also is rooted in recognizing the significance of the 40 days that he spent in the wilderness at the start of his ministry. Some of you may recall that right after Jesus is baptized and that they all hear that God speak over him and say, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased," and they realize this is his identity. He is the one who's uniquely come embodying God himself. That right then it says the Spirit took him out into the desert, to the wilderness for 40 days. And in those 40 days, as you probably recall, it says that the enemy, spiritual enemy, a bit of a mystery to many of us, the devil, came and there those 40 days came to bring temptations to him. And what were the root of those temptations? They were to say, this is not who you are. I'm going to give you an alternative to living faithfully in honor of God and his greatness. I'm going to tell you this. If you will serve me, I will give you power. If you will, you may recall what the enemy says is, I own all the power of the world. I own all the prestige of the world. I own all the pleasures of the world, and I can give it to you if you will only serve me. I think the enemy's been doing that to us ever since. And this is what comes back again, this crossroads, this challenge between serving the one who offers us the powers of this world and serving the one who is the source of all true power. And so we come in this 22nd chapter as Jesus is now in the final days, just before his own death and crucifixion and resurrection. And we pick up and we'll capture three pieces of this chapter, starting in the first 6 verses where it says, "Now, the feast of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12, and Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. So as Passover approaches, what we start to see is that there's this force that is rising up against Jesus. And it's captured there in those words that the religious leaders wanted to get rid of him. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising, because when the enemy came to Jesus in the wilderness, trying to get him to give up and join in with what he had done to all humanity and telling them that, he would give them power, and Jesus denied it. There had been one left in the world who denied that offer and was loose in the world, saying that there was a different power in this world. And so we can see this conflict rising up, and we see them say they wanted to get rid of him. Now that might seem strange. Why would they feel so strong about it? Well, it says here, because they were afraid of the people. That might seem a little strange to us, but essentially, the Roman rule over this area meant that the people needed to keep the peace. And the religious leaders were there to help kind of keep the peace. They could keep their role, their prestige, their power, as long as they kept the peace of the Israelite people living in the land and living in Jerusalem. But when Passover came, that was one of the great festivals by which everybody was to come once a year, especially all the men, to come and celebrate. And so you had this mass of people, and what were they celebrating? Well, as we're going to see, Passover celebrated the freedom from slavery in Egypt. So when you have thousands of people coming into the city to celebrate their freedom, that's a little bit of a loaded situation for those who were trying to rule over them. So it could stir an uprising. And if there's an uprising, the religious leaders would lose their power, their prestige. They had been enjoying so much. They had social respect. They had the wealth that came from kind of getting a little bit more, and therefore in their culture that meant that they were blessed, because somehow they were able to take a little bit more of the goods, and people interpreted that as being blessed. So they were one of the blessed, the respected, and if there was an uprising, they would lose it. And frankly, the people had been turning to Jesus. They had been seeing that he had something to offer no one did. And so if they were to take him publicly, what would happen? The people might turn against them. So Jesus had become a threat, and that's what we need to understand. He's always a threat to the powers of this world. And so Jesus was a reflection of their own vanity. They didn't want to lose the power of this world and what they had been given. And that might seem a little bit vain to us. We think, yeah, they ought to get over that. They were holding on to their popularity, and how vain of them. But if we're honest, we're all vulnerable to that. We all can be ones who kind of opt into this idea that this world gives us power and greatness in and of itself, even at the cost of our own true selves. And so this is what we find, is that they had been corrupted by that. They had become, in a sense, controlled, if you will, by that desire to have power, so much so that they want to get rid of Jesus. That's how uncomfortable he is. That is how challenging it is, because he's the one who exists who never gave himself or sold himself to the powers that be. This is what I've noted in the past that J.R. Tolkien so profoundly captured in his storyline of The Lord of the Rings. Those familiar with it know that at the center of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is this ring. And what does that ring represent? That which one believes will give them all power. It has a way of consuming anyone who wears it. And the reason that they're on this quest as a fellowship to destroy it is, if they don't destroy it, the one who created it will themselves rule over everyone. And so the evil Sauron who created it, it says that whoever gives themselves to the ring, whoever wants and tries to possess it, he will be able, it says, to bend their will and ultimately enslave them. And this is a great depiction of what the enemy of our souls, we're told, worked out with us long ago. In the scriptures, it tells us at the very beginning about our human nature. And it says that there in the garden, where humanity understood itself just simply to be right with God and God's creation and given great purpose by God, until it says that an enemy slips in and suggests it to humanity, the enemy being depicted as a serpent, and depicts and saying, you know what, did God say that you shouldn't do this? He just doesn't want you to be God. Be God yourself. And humanity kind of agrees, and there's this coming together of human pride and the power of evil. The power of evil comes and it plays on what? Human pride. The vanity of saying, I can find myself in myself. I can find greatness apart from the one who created me. And there is the root that has always been at hand. It is why the cry of the soul, even to this day, and in fact, especially to this day, is what? Hey, I'm my own person. As if we've just declared the greatest thing there is. Hey, I'm going to be my own person. I'm going to do my own thing. Have you ever stopped and wondered, what are we really saying? Is that such a wonderful thing? That I'm going to name myself, I'm going to name my greatness, I'm independent of everything else? In the end, well, the idea of independence and individuation from parents and all that, there's a healthy element to it. But in the end, it's a declaration that one will find absolutely leads to lostness. For you have no idea who you are, and you're not in a position to name yourself. And in the end, it becomes self-consuming because we find ourselves in total independence, self-consumed. This is what is happening. And this is why we see that as the vanity of these religious leaders saying that we don't want to lose this power, we're willing to get rid of Jesus. We see the intensity of the crossroads, but then we're told, and the enemy does what? It says he came and he got a hold of Judas. And it says he filled him, he took control of him, he consumed him. And we see this literally as Judas, at the end of all these events, the one who betrayed him, would find himself so lost that he would go out and hang himself. His ultimate demise was to give himself to that which said, go ahead and get rid of Jesus. But how did this happen? Why would he be given to this? We don't know. We can't over-presume everything. But we get hints that Judas had started to feel that Jesus was on a great mission, and he was so, I'm sure, enamored that he had been involved and invited into this mission, but he started to feel a little bit like he was being a little looked over. He was being underappreciated by Jesus. Jesus needed to get them on to take control and overthrow Rome, and he wanted to play Jesus' hand, but Jesus wouldn't seem to take hold of the kind of power that Judas knew they should be pursuing. And Jesus just wasn't doing that. And so, in some way, feeling underappreciated became the seeds. And if we're honest, we might say, I'm humble, I don't want greatness, but as soon as you feel underappreciated, something starts to take place inside of you. It's like, damn, don't they know how good I am? How could they treat me this way? Really, how could they not treat me this way? Don't they know who I am? And that stuff starts to grow inside of us, and it probably grew inside of Judas, and it's into that the enemy came, and it says, took hold of him. And not only would it consume him, but it became the perfect opportunity for the religious leaders, because they could not come and take Jesus in the public light when he came out of his private places and spaces, which they didn't know about, and he came into the temple and such. They couldn't do that there because then the people would turn against them. There'd be an uprising. They needed to know where he'd be at night when he was in private. And Judas, as one of the 12, would be able to lead them to where Jesus was when nobody else was around. And he could be the one who officially identified him to the temple guard to make everything correct. And that is exactly what we know plays out. And so we're told how in the next few verses, which we won't read, how Jesus now sends two of his disciples, Peter and John. He sends them to go to the place that he's preparing for his group to share Passover with. And many have wondered, well, why would he send these two in this kind of mysterious way to find this secret place that none of the others know about? Very possibly because he didn't want Judas to know ahead where they would celebrate the Passover meal, so that Judas would not betray him until later that night, so that he could have this meal, because this meal was so important for him to share. And so this was kept a mystery, this place. And now we pick up where this whole issue of power continues to find itself centered in a particular meal itself. And we read in verse 14, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God, the fullness of God's reign and rule being in place. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Now, for many of us, these words may seem somewhat familiar. We've come and taken the Lord's Supper, communion, whatever our tradition may call it. We've taken it and maybe heard these words read or heard Paul's words referring back to this event and this moment. But what should shock us is that for those first disciples, these words were started out very common, but could not have become more wild and astonishing to them. Because what's happening in these words is Jesus is bringing the whole of their history and our history down to this moment. You may recall that the Passover meal was what they were called to remember, because it was remembering a meal that took place when God brought the freedom of the Israelites from Egypt and being enslaved in Egypt. And what we know is that Egypt had kind of allowed the Israelites to come when they were in need, but then eventually, as the Israelites were growing more threatening in their own growth and population, Egypt would ultimately enslave them there and use them for labor in horrible ways. And you should keep that in mind, because it's a picture, ultimately, of all humanity under spiritual powers. The offer starts good, but it ends in enslavement. And there it was that God came and said to the stubbornness of the ruler, Pharaoh, let my people go. Those were the words through Moses. And the Pharaoh said, no, no, no. And then begin the plagues and the different ways that God's saying, now let them go. And ultimately, Pharaoh's refusal would lead to judgment coming upon. But judgment could not merely to one people. It wasn't judgment upon Egypt alone. It was God's judgment being shown by the fact that he would come and there would be the death of those in the homes. But he did tell the people, but if there is the blood, there is a substitute given, the blood of a lamb whose blood would be over the doorpost. When judgment comes, I will pass over that household. And so the reality of sacrifice and of a life being given and God's willingness to have such a special and lamb be given, a perfect lamb as a substitute, which might seem strange to us, but we begin to understand something of God's own willingness to be met in that way. That takes place on that night, and that is what would bring their freedom, and that is what God said, I want you to eat that meal the one that reminds you of this over and over. Every year you're to meet this. Why? Because this is your history. You need to understand you are a people freed by me. And now Jesus launches in, and he launches in just the way that any group gathering for Passover would. It would start with somebody asking, as some of you know the question, why is this night different than any other? And then the presider would begin to answer that as they would take up the cup and they would say something to the effect of, our ancestors, they were living in affliction. And this is how God came as their Savior. This is how God came and broke them out and gave them freedom. Except Jesus, who stood up with the cup, and they all thought, this is how it's going to go. We're just sharing the Passover meal. Begins to state words that were shocking. The bread, it's my body. You could imagine them thinking, what? The blood, the cup, it's my blood. And Jesus begins to basically tell them and tell us, everything you've understood is the human history being rooted. This story that you must root yourself in, it's only part of a larger story that I'm now fulfilling. Pharaoh, the one that you thought was the one that was the ultimate ruler and controlled everything, actually there's a greater power over all of you. And I'm coming you to bring freedom to that. So all of a sudden the whole story opens up. And what we see is that Jesus in this moment was embodying in himself and reenacting in himself the whole of what they had always known. But to see it bigger, we talked about how Jesus had become, for the people who understood the Torah, the Word of God, and how significant it is a word. For people who live otherwise in silence and know nothing of God, the Torah was that willingness of God to come and speak to his people through these words and the prophets. But Jesus says, I am now the Torah. I become the living Word. What the Scriptures had helped prepare you for and what they speak of, I now embody. And that itself is quite amazing. But now he's come, we looked at last week, and said, you know the temple, the thing that you find all your hope in because you can meet with God, there's a meeting place between a perfect God and a sinful people, you know that temple? It's going to be destroyed. But I am the temple. I am going to become the meeting place where a perfect God will meet with imperfect people. And now he's saying not just the Torah and the temple, but he's saying, and you know the sacrifice that you look back on as the great provision for your story and your freedom? I am going to become now the final sacrifice, the true sacrifice. The end of all history, everything has been moving towards this. Every leader and everything you've seen going on, I am going to become the final Moses, the final prophet. I am going to become the end of history, the center of history as you know it. This is what he's bringing together in this meal. They were to gather it so they would know who they are and they would live accordingly. But now he's saying, you gather around this meal and this event, my death and resurrection for you, my suffering for you. This is what's going to change everything, because it is the culmination of the powers of this world and the one who can connect you back to the true power that is eternal, that is in God. You will either give yourself to the powers of the world like the religious leaders and Judas were being drawn to, or you will give yourself and join me in giving myself to God. This is what Jesus is bringing to bear for them. And he says that this is a new covenant. And for some of us, we hear that and we think, well, covenant, is that kind of religious language or contractual language? What's the deal with a covenant? A covenant, it's not contractual, it's relational. A covenant is how someone gives themselves, not based on the merits of another. That's a contract. A covenant is when someone says, I give myself to you. Now, you will only experience the benefits as you choose to take it and respond. But it's not based on you. It's based on my choice to give myself. And that is profoundly what Jesus is doing in this moment. That we have to hear and take ourselves personally. He is not merely making some kind of vague spiritual thing happen. He is giving himself personally. This is the new covenant that God makes. God is saying, I will bring the sacrifice. I will give myself for you. That's where we are met in this new covenant. It's profoundly personal. And this is why we hear it in Jesus' own words. He launches into this saying what? I eagerly desire to share this meal with you. I hope you can hear a little of that in your heart, because I truly believe those words are meant to fall in every one of our souls right now in this room and forever forward. I, Jesus, eagerly desire to share this meal with you. I give my body broken for what? You. I am pouring my blood out for you. They are to hear that at the depth of their beings. This is profoundly personal, this covenant. He's saying, this is what I bring to this. This is what is so significant about this. And we need to be able to take it in. And he is saying to you, this is the ultimate showdown. This is what it costs to break the powers that have ruled over you. And then he wants us to understand, and this is then how we are to live and follow suit, is to follow him in this way. This is what he means by saying, now you take hold of what I've provided and make it your way. Remember this. He says over and over, do this what? In remembrance of me. Now, when we hear the word remember as Westerners in our language, we hear about like cognitive recall. Oh, yeah, I didn't forget. Yeah, Jesus did that. Like, it's just a cognitive thing. It's just information. But that is not what God means anytime he says, remember this. It's not about information. It's about formation. It is about saying, what I did should change you. What I did then makes everything change. It's a whole new reality because of it. So when he told the people to remember his deeds in the past, God was saying, because of what I did, you now should live differently. And Jesus is saying, remember this, because now it's the new way for you to follow. Because ultimately, you and I have a decision to make. We either will give ourselves to seeking our own self-power, our own self-consuming power, or we will give ourselves to God and say, He is the source of all greatness. I find myself in his greatness. And I know that sounds wild. And it did to them. But it is the ultimate truth. And this is why it is the ultimate consummation, if you will, of this. You may recall we used the word passion, of speaking of the Passion Week, the last week of Jesus' life. And we might say, well, why do we call it the Passion Week? Because he was passionate? Yes, in some ways. But what does that mean? Well, think about passion for a minute. Between a man and a woman and sexual intimacy, you have affections, kind of controlled expressions, but then you have passion. What is passion? It's when you let go of the boundaries and fully give yourself into the consummation of that intimacy. And that is precisely what Jesus did when he said, this is horrible. I don't want this cup of suffering to come. But Father, not my will, but yours be done. In those words, he's saying, I give myself to God's will. I consummate myself. I let this consume me as opposed to being consumed by myself. At some point, I am always challenged with that. Am I going to be consumed by myself or by him? And that is what we see in Jesus. He gave himself into the consummation of his life with God as opposed to what this world could offer him. So he's rejected, but he's ultimately rejecting only the things of this world And this is what we see as we move into that week. This is what he sees in the meal. This is what he wants us to understand about history. As he says, do this then in remembrance of me. Keep coming back to this. And we see this challenge in the final section as it carries on. Right after this meal, he then would talk of how one would betray him, speaking of Judas, but not giving his name. And that stirs them up in a conversation. And we pick up in verse 24, where it says, also a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Jesus is throwing them off because he was the one at the table, but he was serving. So he says, is it not the one who is at the table, but I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Here he says, you may... Now, I don't know about you, but I almost find it comical, and many have noted, like, wait, he just told them he's going to die for them, and then they get into this dispute of who's the greatest? I mean, it sounds like vanity at its worst, almost comical. But perhaps what took place is that he had just said one was going to betray him, and doesn't say who. And it's very likely that they began to say, hey, it's not me. I am not going to betray him. Look how faithful I am. So perhaps naturally what they were doing is defending themselves from any insinuations and trying to show how great they were, and it led to this kind of discussion of their greatness as a defense. What we find is Jesus uses this as an opportunity not to shame them, but to press in and help them understand that your whole pursuit of greatness, you've got wrong if you begin to think in the terms you're thinking in. What makes you great? The fact that you give yourself to serving the things of God, not your own prestige, not your own reputation, not your own self-respect. And so he says right from the beginning, the Gentiles, the people who aren't the people of God at this point or weren't chosen, what's the common culture say? Well, they lord it over one another. So if you have a means to control things, you use control for what? To rule over others. Because it serves who? You. And then he says, and the people above them, which they refer to as benefactors, which sounds like a good word, but in that time, and the word benefactor referred to these who had the most within the culture to be able to kind of use everyone as puppets, meaning they would extend means to other people, but always so they could extract more. So the benefactor would extend things to others, but ultimately everybody owed them. The essence of what he's getting at, the benefactor and the people who lord it over, is to say that the common way culture operates is we give in order to get. You will give to others, but it will always be for what? You. For your self-interest, for you to get. This is what he's beginning to try to address in the people. And he's saying, it must not be like that for you. When you take up this cup, when you enter into what I'm giving you, you are joining into a new community, a new family. In my household, it's different. Remember, he had just shared the meal like as if he was the father or the head of household. And he's saying, in our household, it doesn't work that way. You don't live in this reign and rule, the kingdom, the way our family is, anymore by giving to get. You give in order to serve something bigger than yourself, which is God, and his purpose is for others. And so he begins to speak of this. And this is the heart of what Jesus has been trying to press into so often. Many people will look at his teachings commonly about three themes: money, sex, and anger. Those are three things that he spoke of a few times. And some people think, what do I make of that? Well, you know what's interesting? There are three things that we are never comfortable with. There are three of the inner conflicts that people have in life, probably as much as any other: money, sex, and anger. And we're kind of unresolved with them. And so what a lot of people think is, it's because they're full of shame. That's why Jesus talked about them. They're bad things. Jesus was so clear. They're not bad. Not one of them. Not one of them. What he actually spoke about wasn't money, sex, and anger. It was greed and lust and contempt. That's what he went after. What's the difference? Those are always the reworking of the good to be used for taking from other people. So money isn't the problem. The love of it, the corruption of it, the consumption of it, the desire to take from others, the desire to be self-serving, that's what greed is. What is lust? It is wanting to take from another to find one's own sense of strength. What is contempt? Where your anger becomes an opportunity to want the harm of another. These are the things Jesus spoke of, and these are the things that Jesus says must be transformed within us, to no longer be consumed by ourselves and the promises that an enemy says to us: pursue this, serve me, turn away from God, get rid of him out of the picture, and you can be in good standing. Jesus says no. And he says in verse 27, I am among you as the one who serves. Follow my way. I am the example. And he says, I confer on you a kingdom just as my Father conferred one on me. What is Jesus saying there? I think he's telling us something profound about the relationship between serving and authority, as he calls them to serve like him and trust God to do the conferring. I think we spend a lot of our life wanting to have authority and control. And he's saying you can't claim your own authority. Authority is that which is given to you by God. Do you trust yourself serving God and letting him be the one who gives you and confers on you his authority, his power? Or do you pursue it as your own end, irregardless of him? Jesus says, serve, and the Father and I will confer on you the authority of the kingdom. This is the invitation then to hear what Jesus is saying, that in the midst of this meal, Jesus wants us to understand that there is a grand division of this idea of greatness and power. The Roman Empire, we should go back. Pharaoh, everyone thought had all the power, until God showed up and said, you will be consumed by it. Rome said we have all the power, until Jesus said, if you seek the powers of Rome, you will be consumed by them in the end. The Roman Empire fell. Jesus rose up. And this is why he's calling them to himself and this meal, and to remember it and to make it their story. And he invited us to come to that meal and say, you need to come to it because it is your story. It is the story between the powers of this world that are trying to beckon you and telling you that if you just serve the desire for self-respect and self-greatness and all, that you will somehow become great. It's between that power and the power that says, serve God, and you will find your greatness in it. And that's what Jesus did and led the way for. And he says, you come back and take this meal because what you're remembering is, this is my story. This is what I live out of. And I want to invite us, we're going to close by having an opportunity to come and to take that meal that Jesus gave to his followers. And it defines our story, and it's one in which it is communal in a sense. That's why it's called the communion meal. It's our communion with him. It's our communion with one another. And on one hand, it's the most profound of all meals communally because it says that while blood is a wonderful thing and family being connected by blood is a wonderful thing, we're ultimately connected by something greater than blood. It's our common life with God. And that's what this meal makes possible. But as much as it is communal, it can only be taken personally. Nobody can take the life of Jesus for themselves or for others. We can only take it for ourselves. If there's a great meal at the table and someone was to place a great meal, I can show up to the table and go, this is an awesome meal. You all eat. I'm not going to eat. But I believe in this meal. I believe in the meal, but I'm not going to eat of it. What good does it do? None. I get nothing of the meal unless I actually take it. And that's an invitation for each of us to actually take the life of Jesus for ourselves. That his life would be that life in which we take up and now call upon to live in us and to lead us. So it must be taken personally, but also it's to be taken continually. If you told me I absolutely am into a meal, in 1978 I had a really good meal, and that's the last meal I ate, but I really believe in the meal, you'd be dead. You need to continually eat. It is something that we need continually through our system. And so Jesus says, every time you come, take this meal. Take it often. Take it often. Stay deeply connected to this. And in that spirit, I invite us to take it personally and continually. And if you feel like I am not at a place where I have received Jesus and I'm not prepared to, then please feel no shame in letting that pass. And you don't need to come forward. But in a minute, I'm going to invite us to serve this meal, the matzah and the juice, and you can just dip the matzah into the juice. And we're going to have those serving it on this aisle, in the middle, and on this aisle. But I want to invite us, as we go into this Lenten season, to remember that when Jesus came into those 40 days of temptation, when he left with his nose to the enemy, there was a defiance in him. There was a determination in him. There was a sense that, that you could feel the enemy going, I didn't get him. I've always gotten humanity. I've always gotten humanity to buy into my offers. This one is now loose in the world. This one's now loose in the world, and he says there's another form of power, not the one that I offer. And that became the beginning of the end for the enemy. May we take this meal and say, this is our moment of being defiant, of saying that I am going to be loose in this world because I am not going to accept the temptations to these things, but to be able to go forward with passion, giving myself to something else. Let's pray.